Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. In the wake of a federal court order that declared New York City's stop and frisk program unconstitutional, the police are making many fewer street stops. There has also been a troubling rise in shootings and homicides over the past 2 years, and a controversy has emerged over whether these developments are connected. At the same time, overall crime in the city is low by historic standards, and New York remains the safest big city in America. We'll discuss all of this with my guest, Jenn Rolnick Borchetta, a colleague of mine at Demos, where she is the senior counsel. Ms. Borchetta is a civil rights lawyer who was one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs in the Floyd versus the City of New York suit, which was the lawsuit that led to the landmark stop and frisk ruling. She's now working to establish long-needed reforms in the police department. Jenn, welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Stop and frisk, as it was practiced under Michael Bloomberg and Ray Kelly, who was the police commissioner at the time, was declared unconstitutional, I guess, almost 2 years ago now. So there had been 4.5 million stops over an 8-year period from 2004 to 2012 in a city of only 8 million people. And something close to 90% of those stops had to do with people who had done nothing wrong, no reason for an arrest, no reason for a summons, anything like that. All right, it's declared unconstitutional. Where are we now with stop and frisk? What are the cops doing?
Well, the case that you're talking about is the Floyd case, Floyd versus the City of New York, spearheaded by one of the country's greatest legal organizations, the Center for Constitutional Rights, that is my co-counsel on this case. And in the wake of this court order, what we want is not only the trial decision saying that this practice was unconstitutional, but also a process for developing changes to remedy all of the things we had proven had gone wrong with the stop and frisk practice. And so right now, we, the attorneys for the plaintiffs in this case, attorneys representing the NYPD in the City of New York, and the federal monitor who's appointed by the court to oversee the development of these reforms and the implementation of them over time, are negotiating changes that will reform this practice.
And what are some of those things that we need to be taken care of? I guess the real question is, why wasn't a court order enough? Why couldn't you just say, hey, this is unconstitutional, let's move on?
Well, stop and frisk as a tactic is not itself unlawful. The problem with what the NYPD was doing was how they were using this tactic. They were purposefully targeting it at innocent Black and Latino people. That was the problem with the practice. And how that happened was that many things went wrong within the institution of the NYPD. And the reforms have to be designed to remedy those things. So, for example, there were de facto quotas where the NYPD leadership was directing officers to go out and get stops of what they called the right people, making clear that the right people are Black and Latino people, and then telling officers they have to get a certain number of stops. And so this caused this huge uptick in the number of stops that were being conducted. So one thing we'll have to fix is those kinds of directives to officers. But there are other things like discipline and the lack of discipline, that officers were committing misconduct, they were violating people's rights, and yet the NYPD was sort of putting its head in the sand or turning a blind eye to those problems and not disciplining officers, not retraining officers, not directing officers on how to comply with the Constitution. There will be changes to training. Some changes in trainings have already been ordered by the court for the current police academy class that retrain officers on when it's lawful to stop people, when it's lawful to frisk people. And there will be changes to auditing, how they monitor officers, how they pay attention to when officers are on a mass scale appearing to commit misconduct.
One of the things that I covered this for several years as it was going on. I was always outraged by the stop and frisk program as it was practiced in New York. And one of the things that never was clear to me was, if so many of the people who were stopped, nearly 90%, had done nothing wrong, they were not carrying contraband or weapons of any kind, why did the cops they didn't just keep doing it, they just kept doing it more and more. They increased the number of stops year after year. Why?
Well, I think that's because of direction from NYPD leadership, that they had to get these numbers, that their jobs depended on getting certain numbers of stops, and in order to do that, they were not stopping people when they had a good reason to. So under the Constitution, we all have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. A stop by an officer is a temporary seizure, and frisk by an officer is a limited search of a person. And they're supposed to be doing stops when they have a good reason to believe that person is engaged in crime. And the problem is, if you have to get a certain number of stops, you're not looking just for people who are actually appearing to be engaged in crime. You're going out and getting anyone so that you can put on your forms you've done your number of stops so that you don't get in trouble in your job.
So they knew that it was harassment if they're stopping large numbers of people who have done nothing wrong. And so there were certain folks they thought they could harass and certain folks they would not be able to get away with harassing. I don't think it's clear to a lot of people what police officers have a right to do or what the people are obliged to do when confronted by a police officer. So if a cop, for whatever reason, approaches someone who's not involved in any obvious wrongdoing, what does he or she have a right to do or say to that person?
Well, the officer has the right to speak to members of the public. That is an important function of police officers, to engage with the community. But a member of the public does not have to answer an officer's question. We all have the right to remain silent. And an officer cannot restrict a person's freedom to walk away unless the officer has a reasonable suspicion that this member of the public has committed a crime, is about to commit a crime.
Right.
That's the only reason they can limit a person's freedom to walk away.
And are you obliged to show a police officer identification if they ask you for it?
You are not. There are some circumstances where there could be a consequence if you don't. For example, in housing, if you don't show identification, it might be that an officer can ask you to leave. But you don't.
In public housing, you're
in
talking
public
about,
housing,
yeah.
I'm sorry, yes. But no, you do not have to give an officer your identification. You do not have to answer an officer's questions.
Now, the original purpose of stop and frisk came from a ruling long ago, I think it was 1968, Terry versus Ohio. The original, and the ruling in 1968 was a Supreme Court ruling saying that it was okay. And the point was to protect police officers so that if an officer stops someone, presumably someone suspected of being involved in a crime, and they thought that person might have a weapon, it made sense to frisk that person. You could pat that person down to search for that weapon. And then somehow it evolved into a tool where cops, not just in New York, would just approach people and pat them down willy-nilly. Do you have any sense of how that transition occurred?
Well, I think part of the problem is that the police department would talk about and direct officers to do stop and frisk as though it was one thing, stop and frisk.
Right.
So it's two different things. I mean, you stop someone because you believe they might be engaged in crime. You frisk them only if you believe that they might be armed and dangerous. It's to protect an officer. That's the only reason. It's not to look for evidence. But because it's talked about as one thing, it became an automatic. And that's one of the things that we're reforming right now is the directions on that, making it clear it's two different standards and that a frisk is limited to protecting an officer's safety when there's a reason to believe the officer is in danger.
So I mentioned at the top of the show that there has been an increase in shootings and in homicides in New York over the past couple of years. That roughly coincides with the time since stop and frisk, as practiced under Bloomberg, was declared unconstitutional. An awful lot of people are making a connection. They're going, see, you cut down the stop and frisk program, and now crime is going up. Could you comment on that?
The uptick in shootings and murders is scary, it's tragic, and it was not caused by any stop and frisk policy. If we want to talk about what's causing crime, not only in New York City, but in this country, we could talk about the absence of job opportunities. We could talk about the huge numbers of black people who are missing from their communities because of over-incarceration. We could talk about how we turn a blind eye when our policies perpetuate racial inequity. And while we're having that conversation, we should agree on some basic American principles for policing. Policing in a democracy has to earn the respect of the people being policed. Policing in a democracy has to be grounded in the same foundation as government, of, by, and for the people. And our systems of policing, of government, of justice have to guarantee all of America's people, including black and brown people, equal freedom and equal humanity. And we can't forfeit that because of what's happening in the crime rates.
And as you pointed out, the police are not prohibited from stopping anyone or frisking someone if there's a reason to do so.
That's exactly right. The court order that we won did not prohibit stop and frisk. It's lawful. They just can't target black and Latino people who are innocent.
So when you're talking, you've been talking about these reforms that you'd like to see take place. It's been a while now since the ruling. There was an appeal process. The ruling was upheld. How are the reforms going? Are we making progress? Is it slow? Is there a danger of the effort at reform getting stalled? How are we doing on that?
We're making progress. Because of the appeal, the reforms could not move forward until last October. So the process of developing these changes started last October 2014, and we've been having these negotiations that are very productive with the NYPD and with the Federal Monitor, and there have been reforms that have already been so ordered by the court that have already changed trainings in the police academy. It's a lot of work that we have on our plate in these reforms, but we're making progress.
So the race issue, which is at the heart of so many police issues that we talk about nationally, is also, as you mentioned, part and parcel of the whole stop and frisk issue, controversy, or whatever. Can you talk about how race is involved in policing and why there's a need to confront it if we're really going to make progress on issues?
Well, there's an issue of implicit bias. Implicit bias is that we all have bias, and there's a lot of scientific evidence that we all react to these implicit biases, especially in this country when we've received so many racialized messages throughout our history and throughout our time. And in policing, those manifest all the time, that our law enforcement are over-focused on people of color, and that causes this cycle where, because there's been this focus on people of color, that continues, despite, again, if people of color are not, in fact, guilty of any wrongdoing. And so we can't really remedy this problem of racial discrimination in policing without confronting that, without talking about it as racial discrimination in policing, even if it's unintentional, but it is still often intentional.
Right.
We have to grapple with that, or we won't ever stop this cycle.
So how do you confront it, and how are you trying to confront it in New York?
In New York, one of the reforms that we will be trying to develop goes to training on implicit bias and training on how to encourage officers to recognize when their behaviors might be unfairly treating certain people differently because of skin color in ways they don't even consciously recognize. And it's also about setting policies that are clear about how officers should conduct themselves with respect to people of color, and taking extra care in those interactions so that those tendencies toward discrimination don't end up in discrimination.
So as part of the ruling in the Floyd case, a federal monitor was appointed to oversee the police department in New York, Peter Zimroth, a former corporation counsel. We haven't heard a lot about Peter Zimroth lately. What's going on? Is the monitor in place, and is he working?
Yes, he's working very hard. Yes, so as part of this process, like I said, we're negotiating, and we as the attorneys for the plaintiffs in Floyd, and also the NYPD attorneys, and also Peter Zimroth. So we have meetings, we go over proposed new policies, we edit policies that exist. He did submit to the court new trainings that the court then so ordered, and I think that soon there will be some information about publicly that he files about sort of the status of what's going on in the case.
Right. And then maybe the final question on stop and frisk is, there are many fewer stops now. They had begun to fall off before the ruling, and they've gotten even lower since then. So how is the department conducting itself in terms of stop and frisk now? Are you satisfied with the way the program is going or not?
Not entirely. One of my reservations is whether the recorded number of stops is accurate, which is troubling, and it's hard to get at that question.
Because they're supposed to fill out a form
that's
when they stop someone, is that correct?
That's correct. They're supposed to fill out a form, and there's a question of whether they're doing that when they're required to. But even putting that aside, even assuming that there is a drop, and I think that there is at least some amount of drop, it's not because of any particular direction from the NYPD leadership on a change of policy yet. There are stop and frisk policies that are being changed in the Floyd reform process, but those haven't entirely happened yet. And a lot of what's happening is some unclear combination of officers doing it on their own because of the court ruling and thinking that they don't have to do stops anymore and they didn't like doing them in the first place, or not understanding perhaps currently what they can and cannot do. And so there has to be a lot of education of police officers to make the program operate constitutionally and lawfully otherwise.
You mentioned the fact that police officers frequently were not disciplined if they were involved in stop and frisk. But as we see nationally, all these issues coming up with the police, often cases of people being killed by officers, traditionally there has not been a great deal of punishment meted out for police officers, even when there clearly was wrongdoing. I mean, it just seems to me that if you don't punish offenses, whether it's the President of the United States or a young child in the kitchen, they'll just keep doing what they're doing. Why has there been this reluctance to discipline or even imprison police officers who have been convicted or who have clearly committed crimes? What's the reluctance?
There's a reluctance in holding officers accountable because we are thankful for officers when they're doing work that is good, and we're concerned, I think, about potentially sending messages to officers that would cause them to refrain from doing their jobs in some way. At the same time, we have to understand that if we're not holding police officers accountable, then there are other officers who are learning from that they're seeing that they can get away with things that they shouldn't be allowed to get away with, that we have to, by disciplining officers, hold them accountable to a level of conduct that we require as a society, that all people are treated equally, and we have to part of discipline is ensuring that there's a transparency in the system of holding officers accountable, and that all victims of police misconduct are treated equally as well.
In New York, where you've been looking at stop and frisk specifically, but what about other areas of misconduct by the police? Is there a way of characterizing how the city itself holds or does not hold police officers accountable?
Generally, there's a problem in the NYPD's internal disciplinary system of not holding officers accountable when they're found to have abused their authority by the Civilian Complaint Review Board. That's one problem. And there's also a failure to hold police officers accountable, even if there's no formal complaint against officers, where you have sergeants and supervisors who are, again, turning the other way when they see officers who are committing misconduct. So there needs to be both a formal mechanism when there are complaints from the public that the NYPD takes seriously and follows through with disciplining officers who are found to have abused their authority, and also on the front end, ensuring that officer misconduct is not condoned by responding to it and taking it seriously when sergeants and supervisory level officers see that it's happening.
Right. Now, a lot of people would like to see independent prosecutors appointed in cases of police officers accused of serious misconduct, not just in New York, but in other jurisdictions as well. Your thoughts on that?
I agree that independent prosecutors are important, especially in cases with police officer shootings. It can be very hard for prosecutors who work with officers every day to pursue these cases. And also the public in those cases really needs to believe and have faith that the person who's pursuing that crime is in prosecution is doing the utmost of their ability to get that conviction.
You're involved in very specific reforms here in New York, but as we've mentioned, there have been a lot of problems across the country. If you could just wave a magic wand and have some specific reforms that would apply to all police jurisdictions, what would they be?
Transparency. What are officers doing? Having data on what officers are doing so that we can understand when something is going wrong, especially on a mass scale. Discipline, meaningful discipline of officers and consistent discipline of officers, and also community input, both into policies that police departments are run by and also input in handling cases of officer misconduct.
There have been, as we've all seen, all kinds of protests coming out of Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore. There have been protests right here in New York, in Cleveland, many jurisdictions as a result of, in a lot of cases, these cell phone videos of police encounters, in some cases, police killings of civilians. And there seems to be a real sense of momentum developing out of these protests and demonstrations. Is it having any real positive effect that you can see? And do you have a sense that this will lead to real reform, or are you getting a sense that this may just peter out at some point?
Well, I hope it leads to real reform. And I think that it's been very successful at making this a national issue, at changing the narrative, the focus on Black Lives Matter, the focus on the rights of people of color, of lifting that up, and of making a national conversation of what people of color have experienced for years and years and years, often without that national recognition. That's a huge change in narrative, and I think that in and of itself is hugely important. I also know that there are a number of incredible organizations and incredible people who are working very hard to ensure that this leads to real reform around the country.
So Demos is a think tank here in New York, and I might add, a great one. But how did an organization like Demos, and then you can also talk about you specifically, become involved in these police reform matters? It's not a logical leap.
I think it is a logical leap. I think, maybe not an obvious one, but I think because policing has to do with democracy, how we police people, how we police the public has a lot to do with the public's sense of freedom, and their sense of freedom has a lot to do with how they participate in our democracy. And there's a real link between over-policing people and a reduction in engagement with democracy. And so we have to be we have to think about that link, and I think that's why Demos is thinking about it. Demos is an organization committed to decreasing political inequality, and it increases political equality to ensure that policing is equal.
And then how did you get involved in this racket?
I got involved because in my previous life before Demos, I worked with a civil rights law firm, and in that capacity was one of the attorneys on the Floyd case. And so they came to Demos and they asked for me to come back and help with the reforms and developing the reforms in this case. And of course, I was very excited to have that opportunity.
I guess the last thing I'll ask you about is to try and make a comparison. We had the period in New York before the stop and frisk ruling and then afterwards, and that coincided more or less with the period of Bloomberg and Ray Kelly, and now we have a new mayor and a new police commissioner. How has the police department changed over that period, and has it been a change for the better?
There are changes for the better. I think the police department is more open to change itself, which is a good thing. I think there are some vestiges that continue of not wanting reform into certain areas. I'll be interested to see how we develop reforms in things like discipline and supervision in the Floyd case. Overall, I'm right now feeling optimistic.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Jenn Borchetta, my good friend from Demos. Take care.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. When he was running for president in 1980, Ronald Reagan promised that he could increase defense spending, balance the federal budget, and cut taxes, all at the same time. George H.W. Bush derided Reagan's tax-cutting trickle-down fantasies as voodoo economics, and he proved to be right. That was 35 years ago, but most Republican politicians still have not learned to recognize budgetary voodoo when they see it. GOP governors across the country who have had a lot of fun drastically cutting taxes over the past few years have suddenly stopped laughing, as they are now staring at budgetary shortfalls that are in some cases truly horrifying. These cavernous budget holes are threatening public education, public safety, and other essential elements of government. For example, the budget gap faced by the Republican governor of Illinois, Bruce Rauner, is a breathtaking $3 billion. GOP Governor Bobby Jindal in Louisiana is trying to figure out what to do with a $1.6 billion gap. What so many of these office holders apparently fail to realize is that government services have to be paid for by the taxes so bitterly disdained by the GOP. There is no other way. The idea that you can increase government revenue by cutting taxes was fraudulent in 1980, and it's just as fraudulent today. That's all for now. See you next time.